All right, guys, welcome back. Southeastern 14, and here once again with Nathaniel Rutherford. We're talking Tennessee basketball as usual, but now, Nathaniel, going to the men's side, talk about a couple key additions to the roster for the Vols heading into next season. Rick Barnes and his staff doing some work right now. Transfer portal never stops, as we always talk about, and the Vols have jumped into the mix, adding a couple additions. With Jordan Gainey and Chris Ledlam joining the group here in Knoxville. Let's start with Gainey because an obvious connection when your dad is the associate head coach, sometimes, that can help out when it comes to figuring out where you want to play next season. But we'll keep 15.2 points per game at USC Upstate. As we said, I mean, he's the son of Tennessee associate head coach Justin Gainey, made 73 as a freshman. 74 as a sophomore. Now the percentages dipped a bit.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about like the dip from his freshman season where he shot 49.3. I mean, basically almost 50% from three. Like that's not sustainable. Right.
No.
Steph Curry doesn't do that. So like, I mean, the best shooters in the game don't do that. So like that, it's partially regression to the mean, but also I think has to do with the fact that he was the focal point for USC Upstate on offense this year. Like he was their main scoring guy. So that was also kind of the dividend numbers, but even still, like 34.5% from three, that would be, I think, second, maybe third on the team for Tennessee this past year. Like only
in the SEC. Yeah, in the SEC only, that works.
Yeah, and only Vescovi really is the only guy that consistently has shot better from three who will be on Tennessee's team next year. So I mean, if nothing else, like I'm not, obviously not expecting him to put up 15 points a game next year, but he's a guy who adds another shooter beyond the arc for Tennessee, which they desperately need another consistent 3-point shooter. You look at this past season, you had Vescovi, and when Ziegler was healthy, he could have hit shots from three, but he still isn't the most consistent 3-point shooter that we'd like to have out there. Gainey adds another guy who, again, I would be curious to see how many minutes he plays, what his role will be, other than a guy who I think will be, a bench player, who maybe provide a spark on, from the bench. He's not just some small guard either. He's a 6'4", 175. I imagine, the weight will come up when he comes to Tennessee because of the great strength conditioning program they have here. But I mean, he's a guy who also averaged almost 2 steals per game last season for USC Upstate. So he's, pretty decent on the defensive end too. I think it's a transfer that people, maybe at first blush are thinking, okay, we're just bringing in a coach's kid. Right. But I don't think it's the case. I think he's a guy who's going to be a really nice piece. He's not a, quote unquote big difference maker, but I don't know that Tennessee's really looking for like a bona fide starter who's going to come in and average 15 points a game in the transfer portal. I think they're looking to fill some of the voids, fill some of the holes that they had this past year. And I think Gainey's one of those. And I think he fits the mold of a guy who they need a complementary piece to Vescovi on the perimeter. And I think Gainey can do that. And I think looking at his defensive stats and stuff, he's not a bad defender. I don't think he's an elite defender, but I also think that we've seen every guy who's come in here as a transfer or as a new kid improve defensively since once they come to Tennessee. So I trust that even though he I think has a good base defensively, I think he'll get even better.
Well, and the thing is, and we can tie the Vescovi. Obviously, Vescovi's returning now, and so we know that. But like Tennessee is in a position where, unlike a lot of the other top teams in the SEC, Tennessee has a lot of their production returning in terms of like they have top guys coming back. Alabama does not. Kentucky we know is, Sheboy would obviously be a great starting point, but they're flipping the roster now in a pretty nice way. Arkansas, new roster, right? Like all the teams that kind of we expected to fall into that top tier group in the SEC, having to replace some guys. But like you said, these guys are valuable too. Anytime you have a guy coming in, you say, well, probably maybe not in the starting group, but he averaged 15 points a game and he's going to be able to come off the bench and give you something that's important. And so, I think that's clearly something that you look at with Gainey. And look, he adds something that I guess, like you said, every team needs. You need a team that can make shots from outside, and he can clearly, I think, kind of define a role there with that. All right, let's get to this one because I'm very intrigued by this addition. And that is Chris Ledlam from Harvard. And here's someone, again, to me, we always talk about just kind of the fit with the coach and like the kind of guys that the coach loves. And, I talked about this. I did one earlier talking about Jace Carter, who's at A&M now. And I was like, he is a completely, Buzz Williams, like he's a Buzz Williams player. And like you just kind of can identify those guys sometimes. I think Chris Ledlum is a Rick Barnes player. Like, yes. He just completely fits. You feel like the guys that have had success under Rick Barnes, average basically 19 points per game, basically 9 rebounds per game, shot 47% from the floor, 6'6" forward from Brooklyn. Oh, by the way, Tennessee's had some success in New York, in case you weren't aware. First team All Ivy League player, experience, good defender, toughness to him, and who that reminds you of. I've already seen a lot of the parallels. People are talking about Grant Williams, and look, I'm never going to be someone that goes that far because I'm like, let me see it first. But hey, if you're getting compared to Grant Williams, and like we said, sort of, it feels like just kind of the carbon copy of what Rick Barnes wants and what can succeed in how they play, then I think this is a significant addition, I think, for this team next season.
Yeah, he absolutely is, because especially as we're recording this, we don't know for sure what Josiah Jordan-James and Julian Phillips are going to do. But according to Rick Barnes at the Big Orange Caravan, they're testing the NBA waters, and I would expect both guys to not be on the roster next season. But so you're including losing them, you were losing Olivier Campbell, who again, he's a different position than what Ledlum's going to play. But Ledlum, I agree with that. He, to me, has that same type of feel of an Admiral Schofield, of a Grant Williams, the 6'6", 225, not as good of a shooter from three as Admiral was. But Grant didn't shoot the three from Tennessee. And in fact, that was the big question for him going into the NBA was, can he shoot the three? And he has answered that question big time. He was a really good 3-point shooter the last few seasons for the Celtics. Yeah. And speaking of Boston, where Harvard is, and Chris Ledlum was both these guys, Gainey and Ledlum, were, again, the primary players for their teams and the primary scorers. But really, I mean, Ledlum kind of was the guy. I mean, there wasn't really, I mean, there was a secondary guy for Harvard, but he was the main player for them that did everything. I'm looking at his KenPom breakdown, and the percentage of possessions that he had this season ranked 22nd in the country. The percentage of shots, 15 or 13th. So like his team relied on him heavily. Yeah. Tennessee's not going to rely on him that much, but I looked at some of the the advanced metrics and stuff on him. He is right up there in the top 100 in steal percentage, which Gainey was in the top 100. He's also in the top 150 in fouls drawn per 40 minutes. I looked at that, and he had more fouls drawn per 40 minutes than any Tennessee player. His free throw attempts this season, the 143, would have been easily number one on Tennessee's roster this season. Yeah. That's something that Tennessee has desperately needed the last two seasons. Is you had Kenny Chandler, who was not afraid to drive to the basket, but he's a smaller guy. Zakai Ziegler not afraid to drive the basket, but he's a smaller guy. They're not going to call as many fouls on opponents when a smaller guy's driving in and gets knocked around, as opposed to, in my opinion, at least, a guy who's Chris Ledlum's size, who's 6'6", going up there and fighting and stuff. I think he's going to give Tennessee more free throw opportunities and be a guy who can go muscle up and get baskets down low and be I think a pretty good rebounder as well. He's not the greatest free throw shooter, unfortunately, but he's better than Urosh. But he's a guy who's consistently kind of a 65-ish% free throw shooter. So again, maybe getting to the line may not be a problem. Making the shots might be an issue for him, but he's a guy who consistently scored. I mean, again, I'm not expecting him to match the numbers he did at Harvard, but it still shows to me, Blake, when he scored 20 or more points, I think 11 times this season, and of the 28 games he played in, he scored 15 or more points 22 times. Like, that is consistent scoring. And again, I know it's partially because Harvard relied on him heavily this year, but it just shows to me that he has, in my opinion, skills that can translate to the higher level, because Harvard didn't play against a ton of high quality competition, but one team you can look at that did play this past year was Kansas. He played Kansas, but he also played really well against Kansas. Had some pretty good numbers against Kansas. And again, looking at his time at Harvard, they didn't play a ton of top tier teams, and and when they did, his freshman year he didn't play as much, and sophomore year was different too. I don't think they had as many in sophomore year, but I just think, like you said, he's such an intriguing guy. He's a guy to me that fits, like you said, what Rick Barnes wants. I think he is going to remind a lot of people. Again, I don't expect him to be SEC Player of the Year caliber like Grant Williams was. I think he's going to be not even I hesitate to say poor man's Grant Williams, but he's going to be a Grant Williams type. And again, Tennessee hasn't had that we were hoping to see EJ Anosike be that, but he was not. Clearly, his athleticism he didn't have the athleticism, I guess what I'm trying to say, to play in the SEC, whereas I think Ledlum does. So the Ivy League is also transferring from the Ivy League is very different than transferring from the NEC, which is where
Right.
which is where EJ Anosike is coming from. So I agree with you. I think this is a great pickup. It's not going to be, the biggest all-star pickup that, when you talk about the top 15, top 20 transfers, in the offseason, I don't think Ledlum will make there, but he's not going to be too far outside of that list. I think he's a top maybe 30 transfer in this offseason. So I think he will, again, bring something that Tennessee desperately needed. Gainey brings another option for 3 that isn't just Vescovi or again, Ziegler possibly too. And Ledlum brings that physicality and that ability for a 6'6" wing guard type player or wing forward type player to go in and crash the boards and finish at the rim, because Tennessee has had so much trouble, Blake, in the last few years finishing at the rim.
Yes, they have.
Their posts, especially. Even a guy like Josiah, who, you looked at his body and thought, he should play more physical than he did. And the times when he did play physical, he had some really good outstanding results. I think Chris Ledlum can be, especially if Josiah leaves, I think Ledlum can slot into that role, be a little bit of a versatile defender like James was, and be a guy who has that frame, but maybe uses it more effectively, more physically than what Josiah did.
Well, and here's something to keep in mind too. We talk about just the transition defensively. Harvard was a pretty good defensive team last year. When you look at their numbers, which Tommy Amaker's had some of those there, but it's been a little while since he's had just a great defensive team. I don't know if they were a great defensive team. We're talking about a team that went 14-14. But if you look at the numbers, one of the biggest reasons why they were as good as they were efficiency-wise was because you had a guy like this who had a pretty high percentage of steals, block, those kind of things. And so he definitely played into that. So it's not just what he can do offensively, but like we said, on the defensive side, rebounding wise, he just feels like someone that's going to be able to help them out in a lot of different areas. He's not just a specialist in one area. He's someone that can do a lot of different things. And so, again, kind of understanding what the roster is going to look like next season, I think that's definitely important to have a guy like that. And so, yeah, I think it's just a really nice addition. So,
yeah, and I don't think, again, that Tennessee's done, where there's still a couple. One guy really, and Net is his name, who's visited. Ledlum visited too over the weekend. I don't know if Tennessee will land him, but that's definitely a guy they're still targeting, and I still think Tennessee will target another transfer or two, because again, I think Phillips and James will both leave, and that'll make three guys counting Olivier, who left, that wasn't because they graduated. Well, I guess technically James graduated, but you know what I'm saying. He can come back if he wants to. So. I don't know that Tennessee's done in the transfer portal just yet, but I do think even with these 2 guys and with Santiago coming back, that's a pretty darn good roster. That is a top 15 preseason caliber roster right there, with hopefully Ziegler getting back healthy sooner rather than later too. That's where maybe you want to get another experienced backup point guard, but maybe you feel that if Ziegler isn't quite ready to start the year, you feel fine with Vescovi being your main point guard and having a BJ Edwards or even Jordan Gainey be the backup to start the season until Ziegler is able to get healthy. Maybe he's healthy once the season starts. I don't know. We'll have to see. But even with that notwithstanding, I think this roster as it is right now is still a pretty darn good roster.
Well, as we said, not a lot of SEC teams are bringing back 2 first-team All-SEC guys in Vescovi and Ziegler, and I think that's where Tennessee has a head start. It's just building around and kind of knowing those are still the guys that are going to drive everything. But like we said, I think they picked up 2 guys here that will factor into the mix, and it'll be interesting to see kind of what their role looks like. So there you go. There's some thoughts on the 2 additions here for the Vols. Nathaniel and I will continue to cover this moving forward. Of course, you can watch all the SEC basketball transfer videos I've done to this point, which is just a ridiculous amount.
Good luck
trying to keep up with all 14 teams. But I've managed to get all the transfers in. I haven't got all the transfers out, but all the transfers in. We've covered them here at Southeastern 14. And Nathaniel and I will do kind of a state of Tennessee basketball. We'll do that probably in the next week or 2. We're going to start doing that for all 14 teams, just to kind of where the program are at right now, which is hard to know because, as we said, there's so many roster moves at this point. But we might kind of move that towards the end of the transfer portal, which is mid-May. So we'll kind of talk more in depth about it then. But again, in the meantime, hit that subscribe button. We got a lot of Tennessee coverage here. If you haven't checked this out before, obviously Nathaniel and I have done a lot of Lady Vol stuff over the past month and a half, 2 months now. So you can check it all out there. We probably have some more interviews perhaps on the way as well. So a lot of great stuff. SEC football, SEC basketball, SEC baseball. We got it all covered here at Southeastern 14. So we appreciate you guys watching as always, and we'll talk to you again here soon at Southeastern 14.